Rec- Hello, and welcome once again to the continued discussion and conversation brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act. Yes, and we are presenting the Restorative Justice Cultural Identity Empowerment Project. And of course, most of us are well aware that this is Black History Month, and we are honoring Black history, honoring Black history. And as you can see, that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, of giants, and we are continuing this this journey, this tedious journey, and and proclamation of the truth, doing our due diligence, researching and studying. The book that we are reading this currently, this series is called The Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa and the Sacred Meaning of the Song of Solomon, translated according to the African Palaver by the beloved Pastor Thomas Vanda Odimba, an intellectual and scholar and pastor, an elder from the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This will be discussion number 19. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I just want to preface this conversation with the scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 26. When it was stated, I said I would scatter them into corners. I would make the remembrance of them to cease from among men. Now, in honor of Black History Month, I thought it would be uh, appropriate to bring this slide in again about African peoplehood. African peoplehood rather than the idea of African peoplehood rather than Black individuals, and celebrating African peoplehood rather than Black individuals. And this was a sentiment that was brought up in the afterword to the wonderful Ethiopians of the ancient Kushite Empire, who was written by the lovely Miss Drusilla Dunjee Houston. May she rest in peace and power. In her afterword, it was stated this, quote, Houston's focus is upon African peoplehood rather than upon Black individuals. Let me just read that one more time. Houston's focus is upon African peoplehood rather than upon Black individuals. So often, African Americans appear to become intrigued by a kind of, quote, Ripley's believe it or not treatment of the history of African people. The achievements of individuals are highlighted. What is usually missing in African history presentations is the basic story of a people. The scope, it goes on to read, the scope, the depth, and continuity of the African experience must be understood if any real appreciation of African identity and creativity is to be gained. And again, this was written in the afterword to the wonderful Ethiopians of the ancient Kushite Empire by Asa Willard. And I thought that it was very insightful, a very, very insightful statement that I never even thought about or considered until I read this in the afterword of this book. And so it's within that spirit and that sentiment that we are doing this reading looking not just at, while as marvelous and wonderful as the Black achievements of individuals, I mean, the greatness and the wonderfulness and I mean, just it's all that. But I, I'm I'm more leaning now into this idea of beginning to go into the story of our people, as is the narrative, the historical narrative of a people. And so, we look at this word peoplehood in the dictionary. It's the fact or state of being a community of people of shared race or nationality, often with the implication of associated status or rights. And I think that's such a powerful insight that we can gain from this definition. Especially, in terms of this language used, associated status or rights. And sometimes I think the conversation becomes muddled when we are not aware of where our rights are generated from. And so, this is what it's saying, that often it's with the implication of associated status or rights. And it's also an awareness of one's identity as a member of a particular people. All right. And this is an example definition. My deep sense of peoplehood gave me the fortitude to fight the difficult battles. So it's this whole idea, and in honor of Black history, I wanted to kind of remind those who are interested that this is indeed the direction that we want to go. Now, some who are new to this conversation might be wondering, why are we reading The Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa? Well, because from the perspective of status quo historians, Africa was illuminated by the good news via the Greco-Roman Western world. And this inherent view suggests a considerable dependence of Bantu Africans of the diaspora, as well as of all of humanity, on the West interpretation of the Hebrew biblical text. Biblical interpretive power by specifically Bantu Africans and Bantu Africans of the diaspora has been undermined under the insistence by the Western Academy that their readings and or doctrines are universally valid, whereas their interpretations are deeply anthropocentric and a product of Western capitalist assumptions in their pursuit of happiness as it relates to individualism as an economic philosophy. And I wanted to bring this language in. This is a new word that I want to introduce into this conversation, anthropocentric. And as I was doing my reading, I came across this definition in a glossary of literary terms by Mr. M.H. Abrams, who is a highly renowned, world-renowned scholar and one of the editors of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. And this is like a companion a book to the Norton Anthology of English Literature. If you're into the English literature, then you will also have this glossary of literary terms as a companion. And in this book, this glossary of literary terms book, Mr. Abrams stated this when I read this: anthropocentric. It is claimed that the reigning religions and philosophies of Western civilization are deeply anthropocentric. That is, they are oriented to the interests of human beings who are viewed as opposed to and superior to nature, and therefore free to exploit natural resources and animal species for their own purposes. And then Mr. Abrams goes on to state that this view is grounded in the biblical account of the creation, in which God gave man dominion, quote, dominion over the fish and over all the earth. Genesis, and then he quotes Genesis chapter, Mr. Abrams quotes Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Now, I found this so interesting, how the way he justified this belief of Western civilization, this anthropocentric um, idea. And he justifies it, Mr. Abrams justifies it by basically validating this view by stating, well, it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible that, this idea of being anthropocentric, that, the interests of human beings, you're opposed to and superior to nature and the animal species, and that's why you're free to exploit the natural resources and animal species for your own purposes, because why? It's in the Bible. And then Mr. Abrams quotes Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Now, this is a perfect example of what we've been discussing about taking the sacred text. When Pastor Odimba brought it to our attention that, how the new overlords, namely the Greco-Romans, when they got a hold of the sacred text, the Hebrew text, begin to translate it according to the culture, their own culture. All right. So this is what we're talking about. So why are we reading the Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa? Because their interpretations are deeply anthropocentric. And now let's look at this word dominion before we go in any further. Now, we are researching and discovering through our reading that there are two opposing worldviews. We have the Semitic cultural values and versus the Hamitic or pagan worldview. And this is a perfect example of the language used, dominion, in the Hebrew Bible, that the language that's used in dominion in the Hebrew Bible must not be defined according to the Western religious worldview and culture context, in which human beings are viewed as opposed to and superior to nature, and therefore free to exploit natural resources and animal species for their own purposes. Again, looking at cultural context, Jesus the Semite, he gives us the example of what dominion looks like according to the Semitic Israelite people's culture. In an example recorded in the gospel, we will see that it stands in stark contrast to the deeply anthropocentric cultural philosophies of Western societies, cultural beliefs that are expressed in their social economic policies and practices. So if we look at Matthew, for example, Matthew chapter 20, when it uses this language dominion, it says, but Jesus called them unto him and said, ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be the great among you will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. And so here we see context of the language used in dominion, that he's the master, Messiah, Jesus Christ, is teaching us, his disciples, that when we look at this word dominion, we are not to define it and practice it and think about it in the same way that the Gentiles or the pagans would use this word. That it's actually the exact opposite. All right. So this idea that, we have dominion over the fish in the sea and over all the earth. And you can begin to understand how we would, as part of the culture, how the people who are part of the culture, how differently they would define the use of that word. And again, in John chapter 13, verse 12, there's another text and evidence of the same idea. So after he had washed their feet and taken his garments and was set down again, he said unto them, know ye not what I have done to you? You call me master and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you. So then here again is this another where the master is giving the disciples an example of what it means to be in charge or to be in dominion or to have dominion or to be an authority, right? It is a relationship of reciprocity, and not one in which we would view ourselves as opposed to each other or superior to each other, and therefore free to exploit each other. Okay. It's not an anthropocentric use of the word dominion. Now, why are we reading the Great Secrets of Israel? Some might wonder. Discoveries among the Bantus of Africa. And for those of you who have been following this conversation, please forgive me, but I think it's very important to sometimes continue to review and to always remind ourselves, and preface and define and redefine and keep defining and repeating these words, so that we can, really begin to identify whether or not it resonates with us and it resonates with our research. So why are we reading the Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa? Because we now understand that some of us now understand that the significance of interpretation must be done within a specific context, as that which analyzes the biblical text from the perspective of a de-Hellenized worldview and culture, a worldview that is informed by way of critical analysis of reality. This is a premeditated epistemological critique and reread of the scripture, with the aim of not only understanding the Bible and God within the Bantu African and Bantu Africans of the diaspora experience and culture, but also to break the hermeneutical hegemony and ideological stranglehold that Eurocentric biblical scholars have long enjoyed. So again, we're here reading to not to summarize, but we're reading to analyze. And when we talk about context, we're talking about the condition in which something exists or happens. Just want to define this word context. It's important in analysis because it helps us avoid bias and sift through huge amounts of disorganized information and turn it into something meaningful. Because the fact is, knowledge has little value if it's not paired with context. And I just wanted to add in, that we are being inundated with a huge amount of information, or some organized, some not organized, but we are being inundated with this huge. And my question is all this information that is coming to us, how are we filtering this data? How are we contextual? I mean, it's wonderful to know all this wonderful information, but at the end of the day, if what you're reading or what you're gaining and researching, if it's not paired with context, it's of little value. Now, when we talk about context, it's very important when we're reading critically. This means that we're going to give the information perspective by defining it. And to do this, we need to identify who, right? The author or institution that created or collected, funded the original document, what the audience that information could have an impact on, and what they already know, what they need to know, what is the origin of the text, when the text was written, why, what was the motivation behind the writing, and how, the method, medium, or style that was used to communicate the message. Then we're going to get into language, medium being, was it what literary genre was chosen by the author to communicate this message, what language was used, what that's just the method or the medium that we have to take into consideration. when we are contextualizing what we are researching. Now, context, again, when we're talking about audience, I wanted to kind of bring more information on this idea of audience, because audience is the most, if not the most important part of analysis, and the way I've so far understand it. Because if you don't understand the audience, you don't understand who whom the text was written to, it will throw your whole analysis off. I mean, your whole conclusions, interpretations can be thrown off. So when we're talking about audience, we're talking about the information that the author is directing the information towards, and it's implied oftentimes in the text, then that information and that impact that it could have, and what they already know. So for example, in James chapter 1, it's clear, James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. And so right away, we know who this letter is being addressed to, the audience. And then we can go from there. Another example of this is found in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, where Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered abroad, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 7, to all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. This is who this letter is addressed to. And if we needed more further clarification, we would go back, as I understand the process of analysis and analyzing text, you would go back into the text and see how this language is being used again and then again and again, over and over again. And then we will come to the audience and interpretation of the text, and helping us to interpret the meaning of the text. Now, so what does all that mean? In a nutshell, it means that some of us are taking the Hebrews Bible out of the hands of Greco-Roman Western culture, taking the Hebrews Bible out of the hands of Greco-Roman Western culture. And, when you see the white Jesus, the so-called white Jesus, and then you have, with the long hair and this is what, and so I wanted to also bring our attention to this language here, taking the Hebrew Bible out of the hands. Here we see that we enter into the realm of figurative language, because when it's not being used in the normal way that it should be used, hands, because we know that the Greco-Roman Western culture, as an abstract idea, has no hands. But to convey, to express and to give more impact to what we mean and what we say, we will use figurative language. And this figure in particular is called anthropomorphism. And here, it's the anthropomorphic use of hands, in which parts of the members of the human body can denote context or control or dominion. So here, basically taking the Hebrew Bible out of the context or of the dominion or control of Greco-Roman Western culture. Now, some might wonder, when you say you're reading critically as a righteous act, are you saying that the scientific method is in the Hebrews Bible? It's a righteous act. It's in according to mathematics professor Dr. John Lennox, he defines science as this. Science is basically a method of discovering the truth based on observation, the taking of evidence, and comparing those evidence that can be shared publicly and generally. Now, when we say we see this language, the truth and evidence, we see this same language used in the Hebrews Bible in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, where it says to study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. When we look up this word study in the dictionary, it simply means the devotion of time and attention to acquiring knowledge on an academic subject, especially by means of books. It's also defined as a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation. So if we were to insert this definition into the biblical text, it would read something like this: spend a devotion of time and attention to acquiring knowledge on an academic subject, especially by means of books, to show yourself approved unto God, or um, do a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation to show yourself approved unto God. Okay, so we can see that when we look up words in the dictionary, it opens up more of an understanding of what the process of studying really entails. It's an investigation, it's an analysis, it's science, right? Now, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good or true. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, we see this word prove and true used in this text, which is also the same language that's being used in the professor's definition. When we're proving something, we're providing evidence, of course. We all know this. And lastly, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, and be not conformed to this world. And we know by analysis, this world is the Greco-Roman Western pagan civilization. But be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that the truth, or what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And we know that this world, Greco-Roman Western pagan civilization, that it's about the culture, it's about the worldview, it's about the ideology or the value system. And so, yes, when we see this language used in the Hebrew text, Hebrew Israelite text, we indeed recognize that, yes, the scientific method and critical analysis is a mandate in the Hebrew Bible. And it is righteous. It is indeed a righteous act. Now, I wanted to bring more clarification on, I got a little bit more understanding, I think, on this word ideology that we're bringing out, and this understanding of the truth. And in my last video, we talked about using truth, defining truth according to Strong's Concordance number 225 from 227, true to fact or reality, opposite of illusion. Now, and I wanted to bring a little bit more definition to this truth and this idea of reality that we're speaking of. And I came across this information in the book called The Land is Mine by Norman C. Hable. And I liked his definition of ideology, and I want to use it moving forward. So when we're talking about ideology, we're talking about, as I'm in agreement with Mr. Hable's analysis when he states this, that it is a complex and contested set of ideas, values, symbols, and aspirations being promoted with social and political force in a given literary complex to persuade the implied audience within that text of the truth of a given ideology. And this cluster of beliefs may seek to counter the dominant position, presenting it as alien to the will of God. Okay, so let's just break this down a little bit. Let me read it a little bit slower. So when I'm talking about ideology, I'm going to be using this analysis based on Mr. Norman C. Hable's analysis of biblical ideology. And he states that it's a complex and contested set of ideas, values, symbols, and aspirations being promoted with social and political force in a given literary complex, or when he says literary complex or a text, to persuade the implied audience within that text of the truth of a given ideology, right? And this cluster of beliefs may seek to counter the dominant position, presenting it as alien to the will of God. And so you just kind of have to meditate on this information and go back and reread it. And I think you'll begin to easily pick up where we're going with this term. It's also a pattern of beliefs that function to promote, again, the social and political cause of a particular group in society, to justify its vision and to promote its interpretation of reality as truth. To promote its interpretation of reality as truth. So when we are speaking of the truth, we're speaking of the truth within the context of the social and political realm, in the social and the political context of the Hebrew Israelites. And as it is expressed in the given literary, as Mr. Hable states, the given literary complex or the given literary production. That's how we are defining truth. Now, so what does that look like? It looks like a Hebrew Israelite biblical ideology versus a Greco-Roman pagan ideology, and that's where we're going to get into cultural identity. All right, so hopefully that brings a little bit more understanding. I know it gave me more understanding and being able to really um, just be a little bit more precise in our conversation and discussion. Now, when we talk about be not conformed to this world, we have discussed that that it's referring to the Greco-Roman. It's not the literal physical world. It's a figure. We're entering into the realm of figure when it's referring to the Greco-Roman pagan Western civilization and culture, looking at ideology again, bringing out it. What does that look like? It's an ideology. It's a promotion of an ideology, as Mr. Hable states, that it's a social, political, it's being promoted with social and political force, okay, to persuade. Now, so when we talk about this ideology, what does that look like? I wanted to bring in some more information about what does it look like in real time. And I was reading in this book, Parables as Subversive Speech by Mr. William R. Herzog. And he states this in his section, The Role of the City and Rise of Bureaucracy. Now, he identifies financial bureaucrats, military bureaucrats, and scribal retainers. Some of us already are aware of this being also referred to as men of letters, men of letters. So scribal retainers, I wanted to draw the conversation and to the listeners to scribal retainers. Now, this is according to Mr. William Herzog. He states this, that the scribal retainers also played a vital role in the transition of the usurping ruler's regime from the rule, quote, the rule of the might to the rule of the right, end quote. From the rule of the might to the rule of the right. Now, he goes on to state that the agrarian ruler might have seized control through raw power and maintained it through suppression and intimidation, but he still had to institutionalize his rule and legitimate his reign. Okay, so when we're talking about agrarian ruler, he's saying the agrarian ruler, but it's also a name given to conquest states, or as Pastor Odimba states, as the Assyrians, more specifically the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greeks, Romans, the new overlords. The new overlords also referred to as agrarian rulers or conquest states. Now, Mr. Herzog goes on to state this, that one step in the process was recodifying laws so that they seemingly expressed impartial legal principles with a concern for justice, but actually protected the ruler's interests and the interests of the ruling elites on whom he depended. This process required scribal expertise. Scribal expertise. Similarly, to conduct a thorough campaign of indoctrination, a ruler needed to control the channels of propaganda and whatever mass media existed, thus creating a public climate favorable to his regime. Right? Now, he goes on to state that closely allied with the public propaganda is education. The ruler needed to control educational institutions, which trained the offspring of elites and carefully recruited non-elites for political service. Once again, a scribal class was needed to oversee these programs and implement them. So when we're talking about a scribal class, we're talking about men of letters that are available to articulate and to write this curriculum, right? The curriculum, educational curriculum, and laws, recodifying laws, because remember, the regime has to transition from the rule of the might to the rule of the right. They need scribal retainers to articulate on paper this and institutionalize their rule, thus legitimizing the rule. And this, of course, as Mr. Herzog states, requires scribal expertise. Scribal expertise. Now, what does that look like in real time? An example of a scribal retainer would be someone like, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, this individual, Mr. Bernard Mandeville, and his writing of the Fable of the Bees. And I found this information online on the online library. This, I'm sorry, I did not, I don't have the footnote, the actual source where I found it, but it states that Mandeville, quote, Mandeville held that the selfish good of the individual is normally the good of the state. The selfish good of the individual is normally the good of the state. Mandeville, therefore, not only argued away a powerful reason for restriction, but furnished a genuine philosophy for individualism in trade. Hitherto, except for a very few tentative and unsystematic anticipations, defense of laissez-faire had been opportunist rather than a matter of general principle. Mandeville allowed it to be made systematic. And this is the highlighted information. Pay close attention to. It is through his elaborate psychological and political analysis that individualism becomes an economic philosophy. And he relates that political analysis in his book, The Fable of the Bees, Private Vices and Public Benefits. So here we see an example of how it looks like in real time. When we talk about legitimizing the rule of the conquering nation or the conquerors of the state, of the Assyria or the overlords, the new overlords or the agrarian rulers, the men of letters will then come in and articulate philosophies that justify, they seemingly portray legal principles, but they'll justify the reign of the conquerors and individual, and this is how and why we see this individualist personality in this society today. It's because of these men of letters who have articulated this individualism as an economic philosophy. And so this is why, it's important to, when we talk about be not conformed to this world, because when you have this ideology that's being fed to you, when you don't have the critical analytical tools to understand and to define your reality, you might end up in a becoming someone who is lost, or someone that's the language the Bible uses, lost and without hope. So, we're not against education. We're not against schooling. I was encouraged to go to school. I was encouraged to get as much education. Me and a lot of our people are all encouraged to go to school, get as much education as you can if you have the opportunity. We are not against education, but the problem, as I see it, and as I begin to study and research, I'm finding out that when our kids are not equipped with the critical analytical tools to analyze what they're being taught, that's where we will have the problems, that they're not critical thinkers. And so, but equipping our people, equipping children, and not just our people, but all of humanity with critical analytical skills, then we no longer will fear any education or any propaganda campaign. right? Now, so why the Hebrews Bible? Some might ask, what's so big about the Hebrew Bible? I mean, why are you so fascinated with the Hebrew Bible? Why are we putting the Hebrew Bible as front and center? Well, because according to this Indian philosopher, Vishal Magwaldi, who authored the book that made your world, how the Bible created the soul of Western civilization, it states this, that the Indian philosopher Vishal Magwadi reveals the personal motivation that fueled his own study of the Bible and systematically illustrates how its precepts became the framework for societal structure throughout the last millennium. Mhm. From politics and science to academia and technology, the Bible's sacred copy became the key that unlocked the Western mind. And when you open the book on page 78, Mr. Magwaldi states, the professor Magwaldi, he states this: the Bible's sacred copy became the key that unlocked the Western mind. And he states this: was rationality a coincidence of history? Or did the Bible promote rationality because it informed the West that the ultimate reality behind the universe was the rational word logos of a personal God? It was not, as Indian sages thought, primeval silence, senseless sound mantra, energy, or impersonal consciousness. And in this footnote, he states that the Greeks used the term logos to refer to the spoken word as well as the unspoken word, still in the mind of reason. They also use the term to mean the rational principle that governs all things. And John's use of the word logos became the key to the West becoming a thinking civilization. So when we look at this information from the scholar Vishal Magwaldi, he states that the Greeks used the term logos, the rational principle that governs all things. And was talking about in the book of John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. Well, if we inserted that, the term logos, in the place where it says word, it would read, in the beginning was the rational principle that governs all things. In the beginning was the rational principle that governs all things. So we come to understand that the God of the Hebrews, he's theoretical. And Mr. Magwaldi draws our attention, and he comes from the Hindu tradition. And I would encourage everybody, I would love to read this book on this platform, to go out and read his testimony. And he comes from a Hindu background, Indian. And he's stating that it's not about, this meditation. What did he state? The Indian sages, primeval silence, you know, a senseless sound and mantra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Re, it's not that. It's not energy. How we hear a lot of our people were, or impersonal consciousness, going into these meditative states. He's the witness. He comes from this tradition, but he's saying no, that's not how the Western civilization. When they read that in the beginning was the logos, they went with that, the rational principle that governs. And he states that this was what it was, that was the key that to the West becoming a thinking civilization. And then Pastor Odimba, he states this about the Hebrew Bible: what differentiates history from legend is the discrepancy that exists between some historical narratives that have been written by some of the powerful nations that dominated the Hebrews and the Egyptians after David and Solomon, and what the Bible and Egyptian texts say. By virtue of these discrepancies, we observe a certain war of ideas between the new overlords, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, and the old ones, namely Egypt and Israel. Pastor Odimba states this: any discourse on the history of the Jews must take into account three key factors, namely prophecy. So Pastor Odimba is letting you know right away, if you're going to put the word Jew in your mouth and you want to begin having a conversation about the Jews, the Hebrew Israelites, the Bible, the first thing that you're going to have to recognize is prophecy. Pastor Odimba says prophecy first, culture and history, because the Jews are first and foremost prophecy governed people before becoming historical and cultural people. All the activities of this people over the years were predicted several years in advance by their prophets. Pastor Odimba states this: for this reason, only the Bible can respond to the questions that we cannot answer. Why the Hebrews Bible? Pastor Odimba goes on to state this: nothing was more accurate in the course of the development of the Israelite people than the predictions of Jewish prophets. Those who studied this people in isolation from the factors indicated above find it difficult to explain the discrepancy between what the Bible says and their own opinion. This explains why, in the effort to justify their ignorance and the refusal to accept the Jewish texts, certain commentators chose the easy way out by condemning the sacred writings of the Bible. Why? He says because they don't take into consideration prophecy. They want to study the Jewish culture and the Jewish people and the Hebrew Israelites outside of and not recognizing prophecy. And Pastor Odimba states that you're going to have a problem. Now, why are we the Bantu? Why are we calling ourselves the Bantu? Well, because new research reveals that the transatlantic slave trade's genetic legacy, this was reported by Alex Fox on July 28th, 2020, in the Smithsonian Magazine. It states the study published last week in the American Journal of Human Genetics layers genetic data with historical records detailing enslaved Africans, place of abduction, and eventual destination in the Americas, reports Christine Keneally for the New York Times. Quote, in general, our results are consistent with shipping manifests kept during the slave trade and other historical documents. Records show that 5.7 million enslaved people were forcefully transported from present-day Angola and Democratic Republic of Congo into the Americas. And we found that people of African descent in the Americas have the most genetic connections to Angola and DRC. Now, when we talk about the Bantu peoples, it's as defined by the documents, they are an ethno-linguistic grouping of approximately 400 distinct ethnic groups who speak Bantu languages. And it goes on to state that they are native to 24 countries spread over a vast area from Central Africa to Southeast Africa and into Southern Africa. And just drawing your attention to the highlighted information, the Baganda people of Uganda, the Shona of Zimbabwe, the Zulu of South Africa, and the Luba of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bantu peoples. And they speak the Kongo or Ki-Congo is one of the Bantu languages spoken by the Congo people living in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, Gabon, and Angola. The Congo language is the language. It's one of the Bantu languages spoken of by the people of Congo. And it goes on to inform us that it is a tonal language, and it was spoken by many of those who were taken from the region and sold as slaves in the Americas. For this reason, while Congo is still spoken in the above-mentioned countries, Creolized forms of the language are found in ritual speech of African American religions, especially in Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Dominican Republic and Haiti. It is also one of the sources of the Gullah language and the Palenquero Creole in Colombia. The vast majority of present-day speakers live in Africa. So we know that the Gullah people is in the south of, I think it's South Carolina, the southern part of the United States. So that's why we are the Bantu. We are the Bantu living in the United States, this United States of America. Now, why cultural identity? Some might be wondering, you're talking about cultural identity and power, not human rights, not civil rights, but cultural identity. Why? Why are you, emphasizing cultural identity and not civil rights and not social justice and not human rights? Well, because the early Anglo-Saxon period includes the creation of an English nation. And it's the history of and if you look at the history of the Anglo-Saxons, it's a history of cultural identity that developed from divergent groups in association with the people's adoption of Christianity and was integral. And we all know that whenever we see this word Christianity or Christianization or Christendom, we automatically know by analysis that means that they were reading the Hebrews Bible, the Hebrew Israelite Bible. That is their foundational text that they came up with is Christianity. Okay, the adoption of Christianity, which means that when they started to read the Bible, the Hebrews Bible, and was an integral part of them founding various kingdoms. So here we have an example of cultural diffusion. The elite declared themselves kings who developed burghs and identified their roles and peoples in biblical terms. So here we see that we're on the cultural identity tip because the history of the Anglo-Saxon is not a history of human rights and a history of civil rights. It's a history of cultural identity. And though today they are referred to, according to their documents, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and it's a term that is popular in the United States that refers chiefly to long established wealthy families with mostly English ancestors. And it's a family-based political, financial, and cultural power. A family-based, the Germanic peoples are a family-based political and financial and cultural power. So we're getting into this cultural identity. Now, according to Miss Deborah Hellinga in her thesis titled The Anglo-Saxons as God's Chosen People, she states that this thesis will examine the vernacular works by King Alfred, 849 to 899, the first king of the Anglo-Saxons, and Elfric of Eynsham, 955 to 1010, in a wider historical context to reveal how the Old English vernacular and the connection to the Old Testament Israelites aided in the creation of an identity for the English people and the legitimizing of England. And we want to start really paying close attention to these dates. The first king of the Anglo-Saxons, 849 to 899. So Miss Deborah Hellinga informs us that they were empowered, the Anglo-Saxons, with the creation of an identity. They constructed an identity by identifying themselves and connecting themselves to the Old Testament Israelites. Now, when I want to do a recap, and this is again before we get into the next part of the reading, I wanted to just give this information as more context. Remember, we're always wanting to define and keep defining the conversation and contextualizing the conversation so that we can have more understanding. And wanted to talk about a little bit, bring this information in about the slave trade, the Portuguese slave trade, and Pope Nicholas V and the Portuguese slave trade. Now, as a reminder, this is written, Pastor Odimba states that as a reminder, in the 15th century, a large Jewish community was formed around the temple in Zimbabwe. She invoked Zambi, who comes from Jabne, the eternal, who will return us to Zion. And this is where we will rebuild this community, and it's called the Shona, the Zionist or the Limba people of peace. And the name of the attribute of God has remained as the name of the countries like Zambia and Mozambique. Pope Nicholas V ordered the King of Portugal to exterminate this community with firearms provided by the church. This is in the 15th century. And the populations took three directions. The north, those who formed Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Rwanda, Uganda, and the east of the Congo. And those of the west formed the Galan or the Ngala, Angola. So Pastor Odimba, he brings in Zimbabwe in the 15th century. And when you look up Zimbabwe in the Wikipedia Free Encyclopedia, here's what they state about Zimbabwe in the 15th century. They write that Great Zimbabwe is a medieval city in the southern eastern hills of Zimbabwe near Lake Mutir Kiwi and the town of Masvingo. It is thought to have been the capital of a great kingdom during the country's late Iron Age, about which little is known. Construction on the city began in the 9th century and continued until it was abandoned in the 15th century. Okay, so you see how they say that it was abandoned in the 15th century. And interestingly enough, it was in the 15th century that the Pope Nicholas V ordered King of Portugal to exterminate the community in Zimbabwe. So, by analysis, we understand exactly why this place was abandoned. Now, the edifice are believed to have been erected by the ancestral Shona people. And Pastor Odimba identifies the Shona as the Zionist or the Limba people of peace. And the stone city spans an area of 7.22 square kilometers and could have housed up to 18,000 people at its peak. Okay. And it is recognized as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. So let's go more into this Portuguese slave trade that was initiated by not initiated, but the orders that came from Pope Nicholas V. Now, Pastor Odimba states that the Pope ordered to circumvent Africa and attack them by Angola, and the people went to the north to form the Congo, or several names known as the Shona, Siona, and these priests who engraved the letters in the province of Bandundu at the Bambala. This writing is called the Muna, forbidden to write. And he's talking about the Paleo Hebrew that was found in the caves in Congo. Now, to the south are the Zulu, which means heavenly people, and Pastor Odimba states that the Vatican ordered the Arabs to infiltrate the Tutsi shepherds in Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi as slaves of the priests. And if you read the German authors and the works of the White Fathers, a spectacular mosaic of Judaism was found in this region, which had 3 stars of David, which you can find today on the flag of Burundi. And France armed these Tutsi to exterminate all these descendants and erase their traces and culture with the help of Islamists from Kenya and Somalia. And this is what gave the war in Eastern Congo 12 million deaths, and in the Congo 4 million, in Rwanda 2 million, in Uganda. So here I found this information online, Pope Nicholas V and the Portuguese slave trade, where this here is the actual copy or picture of the papal bull of Pope Nicholas V, Portugal, 8th January 1455, which is the 15th century. Courtesy of the Arquivo Nacional de Torre de Tombo, Lisbon, Portugal, this papal bull legally granted Portugal the right to enslave any and all people they encounter south of Cape Bojador on the coast of Western Sahara. About midway through the bull, the Pope declares all sub-Saharan Africans henceforth be held in perpetual slavery. And this is online. The Portuguese made direct contact with the Congolese vassal state and its ruler in Angola in 1520. After that, later requested missionaries. I wanted to highlight how after they went in, this is the process, what it looks like in real time, and later they will request missionaries. Now pay close attention to these dates and these missionaries, because I want to bring some more information about these missionaries. Now, before we get into the missionaries, we want to look at the British, the Anglo-Saxon British, and the Portuguese, the two players, the characters that we've been discussing thus far. Now, the British-Portuguese relations are foreign relations between Portugal and the United Kingdom today. The relationship largely driven by the nation's common interests as maritime countries on the edge of Europe and close to larger continental neighbors dates back to the Middle Ages in 1373 with the Anglo-Portuguese alliance. We're talking about this alliance, we're talking about a military alliance. So from the 1373, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, the two countries now enjoy a friendly and close relationship. In 1373, the Kingdom of England signed the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, the oldest alliance in the world still in force. All right. Now, when we're talking about the Kingdom of England, it is the Kingdom of the English, literally Kingdom of the English, or Kingdom of the Angles, was a sovereign state on the island of Great Britain from 12 July 927, when it emerged from various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, until May 1st, 1707, when it united with Scotland to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Giving us shedding more light on the Anglos and people, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the early missionaries, this was an article online, BBC World Service, the story of Africa about Christianity and the early missionaries in Congo. Now, it's recorded that in 1490, okay, remember that's the 15th century, the first missionaries came to sub-Saharan Africa at the request of King Nzinga of Congo, also known as the Mani-Congo. They came with craftsmen who rebuilt the Mani-Congo's capital in stone at Mbanza, Congo, in the north of modern Angola, and baptized the king. King Nzinga's son, Afonso, born Nzinga Mbemba, was sent to Portugal to study and amazed the Catholic hierarchy with his intelligence and intense piety. Quote, "It seems to me from the way he speaks as though he is not a man, but rather an angel, sent by the Lord into this kingdom to convert it. For I assure that it is he who instructs us, and that he knows better than we do the prophets and the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. and the lives of the saints, and all the things concerning our Holy Mother, the Church. For he devotes himself entirely to study, so that it often happens that he falls asleep over his books, and often he forgets to eat and drink in talking of the things of our Lord. Now, this was recorded by the Franciscan missionary Rui de Aguiar, and this missionary was writing to the King Manuel of Portugal about the piety of the Mani Kongo, King Alfonso, May 25th, 1516. So let's look into this. Why are we talking about cultural identity empowerment? And we look at, we're trying to break this down and really understand and critically analyze our reality. We find that as is recorded by in her thesis, Miss Deborah Hellinger, she states that in 849, with this King Alfred is the first king of the is installed as the first king of the Anglo-Saxons. In 1373, which is the 14th century, we have the Kingdom of England signing the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, which is the oldest alliance in the world still in force. And then in the 15th century, we have the Pope Nicholas V and the Anglo-Portuguese slave trade, 1452 and 1455, where you have Pope Nicholas V, where he legally grants Portugal the right to enslave any and all people they encounter south of Cape Bojador on the western coast of Western Sahara. And about midway through the bull, the Pope declares all sub-Saharan Africans henceforth to be held in perpetual slavery. So remember, this is all happening legally. It's all legal. Now, so I wanted to pay close attention to this language here, and we continue to read in this document I've got online. It states that the 15th century Iberian legal traditions regulated Christians' treatment of Jews, Muslims, and other Christians, clearly delineating, for example, who was enslavable and who was not. So basically, they're stating that if you were a Jew, they would not enslave you. And so the question is, okay, they're saying that if they did not enslave Jews in this document. It's recorded history that 15th century Iberian legal traditions regulated Christians' treatment of Jews, Muslims, and other Christians, clearly delineating, for example, who was enslavable and who was not. In contrast, the juridical status of people who did not fit these categories was more ambiguous. Legal and philosophical arguments to address this issue began to evolve during the second half of the 15th century, once Portuguese mariners began to return to Iberia with captives acquired in West Africa and West Central Africa. Notably, the treatment of, quote, Black Gentiles, end quote, was addressed in 1452 and 1455 when Pope Nicholas V issued a series of papal bulls that granted Portugal the right to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. Church leaders argued that slavery served as a natural deterrent and Christianizing influence to, quote, barbarous, end quote, behavior among pagans. Using this logic, the Pope issued a mandate to the Portuguese king, Alfonso V, and instructed him, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. I'm highlighting some language here that I want to really focus in on. The treatment of these Jews, legal and philosophical arguments, the referring to Black Gentiles, referring to them by the Pope as Black Gentiles and pagans. And here again is that copy of that papal bull that you can find online. Now, so let's break this information down a little bit and analyze this information. So here we have, they're stating that they didn't, if you were a Jew, they wouldn't touch you. Okay. Only pagans, Black pagans. So, but it's interesting because according to this document here, the missionary, she's quoted as recording that it seems to me the way he speaks that he is not even a man, but an angel. And he was sent by the Lord into this kingdom to convert it. Now, these are these Black pagans, these Black Gentiles that the missionary, the one who's having first one-on-one conversation with. She states that, for I assure that it is he who instructs us, and that he knows better. He talking about the Black Gentiles and the pagans know better than we do the prophets and the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and the lives of the saints and all the things concerning out the Holy Mother, the Church. So this is what the war that Pastor Odimba is referring to, a war of ideas and the discrepancies that exist. So here it is in real time. And I want to also draw our attention, the lifelong learners, to this language that's being used, that the legal and philosophical arguments that were used to address this issue. And here it is, this word legal, implying and stating that explicitly that this was all done legally. The enslaving of Black Gentiles, quote unquote, the barbarous, these pagans, this was all done legally. We want everyone to remember this. This is recorded. It's going down in history. It's all above board. But remember when Mr. William Herzog in his book stated that the new overlords, or the conquering, what did he call them? The agrarian ruler. We also know them as the new overlords, the conquest state. That laws or reports that seemingly express impartial legal principles with a concern for justice, but actually protect the ruler's interests and the interests of the ruling elites in whom they depended, that this requires scribal expertise. This is where these legal and philosophical arguments are coming in. Here, they're calling for the men of letters now. Men of letters, scribal expertise. Now, we need some some laws to say that we can go into sub-Saharan Africa and kidnap and enslave them legally. And so how are we going to do that? Well, notably, we're going to refer to them now as Black Gentiles. And this is where they begin to, the language comes in now, pagans and Black Gentiles, the barbaric. And this language for profit, right? In order, at the end of the day, it's about the money, honey. And so this is what we want to analyze. Now, it states in the document that in 1483, now we're talking about chattel slavery, kidnapping, chattel slavery. Go look, we're going to do the research. Go look up what the difference between, the different slavery when it's used in the Bible. There's different, but slavery is used, slavery has different meanings. And we're talking about in this situation, this case, chattel slavery. And remember, we discussed in a previous videos that, wage, the relationship that workers have with employers today is considered wage slavery. I mean, it's widely known and published. It's a form of slavery. So we're talking about in this situation, chattel slavery. And in 1483, the Portuguese explorer Diogo Chao reached the coast of the Congo Kingdom, and he left some of his men in Congo and took Congo nobles to Portugal. He returned to Congo with the Congo nobles in 1485. Such commissioning, hiring, or even kidnapping of local Africans to use as local ambassadors, especially for newly contacted areas, was by then already an established practice. And so when we're talking about the Pope Nicholas V and the Catholic Church and whatnot, and them, claiming to be God's chosen people, the new chosen people, identifying themselves as the Old Testament Israelites, they forgot this text here in Exodus chapter 21, verse 6, where chattel slavery and the kidnapping of people is a capital offense in the Bible. It's a capital offense. The death penalty. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in its kidnapper's possession. So here, if you're selling, for profit, you're to be put to death. That's according to the Bible, to the Hebrew Israelite culture. But the Christians, kidnapping was already an established practice. So here we have some contradictions that we have to now they swear that, here's a picture here, an image of the inauguration of Washington as the first president of the United States, April 30th, 1789, at the Old City Hall, New York. Washington used the Holy Bible. This is a Getty image. Okay, swearing on the Bible. And so it makes you wonder, think about some things. Now, why cultural identity empowerment? And here I tried to create an infographic that kind of helps me to see visually what it looks like, what this whole thing looked like, this whole process looked like. And here, as you can see, the Kingdom of England on the left and the Kingdom of Portugal on the right, and then the Anglo-Portuguese alliance in the middle. And on the bottom is the Kingdom of Congo. And these nations are standing on the foundation of the Kingdom of Congo. I was trying to make this like as the foundation that these kingdoms and these nations are built upon. Now, let's remember that the Anglo-Saxons constructed their cultural identity. That's as God's chosen people, that this is what is recorded. that their history is a history of the construction of a cultural identity. Where did they get that cultural identity from? Well, as God's chosen people to enslave for capitalist profits, Black Gentiles, according to them, according to their ideology and worldview. And today, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant they are long established, wealthy families with mostly English ancestry. And it's a reference to a contemporary family-based political, financial, and cultural power. So why cultural identity empowerment? Why is this presentation? We're continuing to, really define our conversation. Why culture? Why is the cultural identity is entitled? This series is entitled the Cultural Identity Empowerment Project because someone asked the question, who's to blame for the Black and white achievement gap? Christina Samuels on January 7, 2020 asked the question, who's to blame for the Black and white achievement gap? And the Joint Economic Committee, the report that was put out about the economic state of Black America in 2020, one of the things that was brought out in that report, and I recommend that everyone have this report and read it. It's very sad. The problem is that the median wealth of Black American families, one of the main problems is that the median wealth of Black American families is only 1/10 that of white families. And some of us want to know how we can solve this problem. And here's the bar graph here, where here's the white families, non-Hispanic, the red bar, and here's the Black family, the navy blue. And this one is all other races. This is the bar graph. So why, in the report, it goes on to state that in terms of wealth, the median wealth of Black American families is only 1/10 that of white families. A college education does not decrease the wealth gap. In the Joint Economic Committee in the Economic State of Black America 2020, the report also states that historical disparities perpetuate the Black American, white American wealth gap. Many Black African American college students, graduates have difficulty paying off student loan debt, and Black Americans approaching retirement have far less savings. So who's to blame? Miss Christina Samuel said, who's to blame for this? So when the report stated stated about the historical disparities that it stated that is what perpetuates the Black and white American wealth gap. It's historical disparities. And so when we go into the history, we're looking at what is the history? What are the historical disparities? And it just brought me back to the history of the Anglo-Saxons is a history of cultural identity. Bringing it into context. Now, there's a problem that we're trying to solve today. We're trying to solve a problem because according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 83% of Blacks in America were not shown proficient in reading at a 12th grade level. And this was it was brought to my attention by Miss Candace Owens when she brought this information out at the hearing on racism in the subcommittee hearing on racism in Washington, D.C. That's when it was first, I was alarmed when I heard the results, the research that came out. 83% of Blacks in America were not shown proficient in reading at a 12th grade level. Now, the question then is, the question is, who's to blame for this? Well, in the antebellum South, the answer was relatively simple. We're talking about illiteracy. Who's to blame for the illiteracy rate, the illiteracy rate of Black Americans? Who's to blame for, and when we're talking about illiteracy, we're not just speaking about, the ability to sound out words, phonetics, being able to actually, we're not necessarily just speaking about that skill. We're also talking about an illiteracy in terms of your lack of knowledge, our lack of knowledge of history, our lack of knowledge of ourselves, our lack of knowledge of our culture, our lack of absence of knowledge of, mostly importantly, of our history. Because Miss Drusilla Dungy Houston brought out in her book, in the afterword of the Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire by Asa G. Hillard III, he states that an individual who loses his or her memory is disabled. So it is with the people, African and African diasporan people have, in large measure, been deprived of the most important memories of history. Those who have enslaved and colonized Africans have understood fully the powerful role that history plays in the life of a people. Enslavers and colonizers have spared no effort to keep the truth of African history hidden. So when we're talking about illiteracy, we're talking about, in addition to, the phonetic component of literacy, but also those who are disabled in that they don't know their history. And he states that also that if any other group, he states that if any other group of people on the face of the earth had a history as that of Africa to which they could appeal, we would be hearing about it constantly. But be that as it may, the real tragedy is that so many Africans and African diasporans are attempting to understand their own place in the world without the benefit of an accurate history. And so when we're speaking of this illiteracy, we're also speaking about the lost knowledge of culture, identity, personality, roots, origins. And so the question is, who's benefiting from illiteracy? And the answer is, in the antebellum South, the answer was relatively simple: slave owners and an economy based on slave labor. And I find that interesting. Here, they have put out this document online about the it's the social pyramid. Some of you are aware of the social pyramid, and here's what the social economic structure of this society looks like. At the very top of the pyramid, you have the central bankers, 0.00001%. We're talking here about the Federal Reserve's Bank of Japan. And then next would be the 0.0001% big bankers, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Lloyd's. 0.35% would be the corporate elite, Fortune 500 companies and your multinational companies. 0.2% would be your elected officials. presidents and representatives. 0.2% would be the top bureaucrats. We're talking about your commissioners, secretaries, or your judges. 0.75% would be your top professionals, doctors, lawyers, entertainers, your clergy. And then at the very bottom is 98.5%, everyone else. And they compare this social economic structure to that of medieval feudalism, where at the very bottom you have the peasants, the laborers, and the the peasants and the laborers, right down here. Now, so when we look at this structure, we see that it's the same, according to the individuals who's done this research, that it's the same exact structure as medieval feudalism. They call it corporate feudalism here. Now, so it's all about the social economic structure and the is it by design? It's in the structure of the system. Now, so let's continue on with our discussion. Marcus Garvey stated, so why cultural identity empowerment? Why? Because we're looking for a solution to this problem. The question, someone asked, who's to blame? For the achievement gap, the wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans in today. Who's to blame? And in investigating those questions, the problems and solutions, we are understanding maybe what's going on, looking at this information. And Marcus Garvey, the elder Marcus Garvey, may he rest in peace and power, stated that a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And we don't want to be likened to a tree without roots. This is Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act, Cultural Identity Empowerment Series, discussion number 19. Now let's get into the reading. Continuing on with The Great Secrets of Israel by Pastor Odimba, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa and the Sacred Meaning of the Song of Solomon, translated according to the African Palaver. And the preface in his book, Pastor Odimba's book, states this: having placed the book in its context, he discovered that this book came from Africa. Given his knowledge of various African languages, even of ethnic groups that have long been forgotten, he quickly understood the mystic language of the Song of Solomon. After consulting the elders of Kongo, he was able to interpret verse by verse this book, which was until then impenetrable. Now, according to the Bantu tribes of Africa, the latter believed that they belonged to a dynasty, a line of hereditary rulers that can only be that of the family of Joseph, and according to them is the basis and formation of all the Bantu tribes in Africa, right from the time of Joseph all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So here, boom, we have the elders of Kongo have spoken, our forefathers and mothers have spoken. They are now speaking, our ancestors and elders are speaking and have spoken that, according to them, the Bantu tribes of Africa are the basis and formation, are a line of hereditary rulers that can only be that of the family of Joseph. And according to them, according to our elders of Kongo, is the basis and formation of all the Bantu tribes in Africa, right from the time of Joseph all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So here we're talking about the story, the African peoplehood, the story of a people. Now, I wanted to just bring in this little bit information before we continue the translation of the Song of Solomon. And we're going to just read a few verses of chapter 2. Now, Pastor Odimba draws our attention to the fact that the fifth king of this dynasty was Simon. And this is just bringing us current to the translation of the Song of Solomon. The Song of Songs, quote, Pastor Odimba states that the fifth king of this dynasty was Simon, the contemporary of David, and this was the king who organized the extermination of all the Hamites together with David. This was the king who organized the extermination, and linked Egypt to Israel. Footnote 15, this achievement of the dreams of David raised him to the status of a great prince of Israel, just like Joseph. His victory was crowned with two inverted pyramids that we call the Star of David, an Egyptian symbol of union between the two kings and their kingdoms, Egypt and Israel. Footnote 16, this alliance made it possible to rescue the rest of the Semitic Egyptians and Hebrews who remained under the domination and the persecution of the Hamites in order to end the 21st dynasty. It also marks the end of this Hamitic race that the Jews called a barbaric people. Psalms 114, Isaiah 33 and 19. The Hamitic fugitives formed the kingdom of Saba to the north of Arabia. Others were dispersed towards the north of the Isthmus in Crete, Arabia, Assyria, and Rome, far from the frontiers of Egypt and Israel. And this was quoted from his book, the section of the book, The End of the New Empire and the Persecution of Egypt, the persecution in Egypt. Now, on page 15 and 16, the Hamites, or the descendants of Ham, Pastor Odimba states this, that the Bible and Egyptologists do not give any indication of the presence of a Hamitic or Hamite race in Egypt before the era of Abraham. Sheikh Anta Diop, who treated this topic of the Egyptian culture from within Africa as against others, Africanists, who presented perspectives on it from an external standpoint, identified the presence of the Hamite race in Egypt during three periods: under the New Empire, that of Ramses, under Herodotus, that's with the domination of the Roman and Greek empires, and under the Mamelukes with the dominance of the Eastern Roman Empire. These three periods, which are indicated in history, Ramses, Herodotus, and Mameluk, were simply those during which the Hamites dominated and took power after a long period of meticulous maneuvers of infiltration into the existing social political system. Footnote 9. And on page 32, the duration of the real persecution. During the era of Solomon, an intimate relationship was reestablished between the kingdom of Joseph and Israel. This was impossible during the existence of the new empire. This opening of the frontiers enabled the Jews who had formed an important colony in Egypt to pay regular visits to Israel, starting from the era of Solomon up to the fall of Jerusalem. 1 Kings 4:21 states, quote, and Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life, end quote. This alliance between Egypt and Israel, which was formed under the reign of Solomon by the use of the Song of Songs, which became the most sacred book of the whole Jewish tradition. From this era, the people of Israel were considered in a special way, as described in certain 2 Chronicles 7 and 8. Quote, at that time, Solomon held the festival for 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation from Lebo, Hamath, to the Wadi of, or Valley of Egypt, end quote. All right, so that was just some context before we get into the actual translation of the Song of Solomon. And I just wanted to remind those who are following this discussion, remind us that this giving some more context about Solomon during the era of Solomon, and how this book, the Song of Solomon, as it was stated, that the alliance between Egypt and Israel, this alliance between Egypt and Israel, which was formed under the reign of Solomon, it was formed by the use of the Song of Songs. So I'm just going to translate what we've already read, the translation, chapter 1 of the Song of Songs, verses 1 through 8, translation according to the elders of Kongo. Verse 1, let him officially and solemnly declare this union between him and me, or simply let him openly accept today our alliance with his kingdom. Verse 2, it is the news of the great fame of your kingdom that was conveyed to the various nations that obliged us to come over to you. That is why the ancestors of our kingdom were interested to meet you. Permit us to engage your attention as long as possible. It is our belief that the king will allow us to go into the details of the history of his people and his kingdom. Verse 4, with this permission, we are going to engage your attention on an issue that will give the whole gathering pleasure, and your joy will transcend that of an intoxicated person. This will lead us to a brotherly festival, and that is why the ancestors of our people sent us to you. Verse 5, we are the Black race, and we are acceptable in your kingdom. Verse 6, as the Kedars who live separated from other people, as the curtains that make up the palace of Solomon are separated one from the other by walls, so we are with you. We are the same people, but separated from each other. Do not be surprised by the color of our skin. We live under the sun. Our own brothers rose up against us, and we fought and had to keep watch day and night to protect the territory. That did not allow us to take care of you or our own people, Israel. Verse 7, show us, oh, you that we have long looked for. Introduce all our people to us. Tell us how they live and show us the boundaries of their land. Why should we be like a people who are lost, separated from you and living beside other kings? And then Solomon replies, verse 8, if you did not know, O you who constitute the better part of our people, our desire is that you could join us and that your large and small tribes get associated with the various tribes in our kingdom. Okay, so let's continue on chapter 1. We left off at verse 9. The translation of the Song of Solomon in the framework of the African Palaver, the genre is that of a prophetic narrative. Chapter 1, Solomon states on verse 9, quote, I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots, end quote. And we left with the question, what do you think this translation is? This explaining a courtship situation between a man and a woman? All right. One moment, please. One moment, please. Okay, So Pastor Odimba states that in regards to verse 9, the comparison between the mare and the chariots of Pharaoh could be difficult to explain in a courtship situation between a man and a woman. That could create the impression that this young woman was previously part of Pharaoh's household or was a servant of Pharaoh and thus rendered special services to him. If that was the case, it will be difficult to imagine of what use she would be to Solomon, who already had a harem of women. In the African Palaver, this expression explains that people belonging to a king could be used by another king as a way of glorifying the latter. The translation, to my people who are associated with the people of Pharaoh in order to glorify him. I compare you, dear friend. Here, the word beloved is used in this sentence, would translate as a beautiful young lady or companion. Translation, you are very precious in our midst. It continues on. King Solomon states in verse 10, quote, your cheeks are comely with ornaments, your neck with strings of jewels. Verse 11, we will make your ornaments of gold, studded with silver. Mr. Odimba states this, let us note the sudden change on the part of Solomon, who begins to make promises to the lady he considers as a friend, promising her expensive ornaments. He describes her neck and talks about her cheeks. Are all these about a woman from Palestine and its environs? Certainly no. It is obvious that after 4 centuries before the Exodus and 3 centuries of separation from the Exodus to the time of Solomon, when contact was broken in Israel, the Jews who remained in Upper Egypt became like the Nubians. Apart from the fact that they could be dark-skinned, they also underwent remarkable anthropological influence because of their interaction with the Hyksos, their patrons, who were of Bachmain race. The major morphological distinctions between the 2 Black races that were in Egypt were related to their cheeks, their neck, size, and teeth. Translation, do not worry. This difference of your cheeks and your neck does not worry us in any way. You have the honors that you are worthy of. We shall crown you with gold and silver ornaments. And notice this language here, Pastor Odimba states, we, as if he engaged a number of people in his relationship. He says that it is noteworthy that in this sentence, he uses the plural we, as if he engaged a number of people in his relationship. And now the Sunamite, the Black from Egypt, she replies, the character, the Sunamite, replies, verse 12, quote, while the king was on his couch, my nard gave forth its fragrance. As in the earlier passage, we are not in position to say whether the young lady was able to discern the perfume of the king while he was in the midst of his entourage. In the palaver, when someone has not yet expressed his or her thoughts, it is said that he or she is in his or her entourage or at his frontage. The translation of verse 12, we could feel your sentiments towards us even before you would express them. All right, and here is an image of the spikenard, which is an aromatic Himalayan plant believed to be the spikenard, the source of an ointment that was used by the ancients. Okay, it continues, the Sunamite, the Black from Egypt, verse 13, quote, my beloved is to me a bag of myrrh that lies between my breasts, end quote. Pastor Odimba states this, why does the Sunamite mention myrrh that is a product that is used for embalmment? According to the Bible dictionary, the myrrh is a perfume that the ancient people used to embalm the dead. The corpse that was embalmed with this product smelt of the myrrh. The myrrh thus symbolized the souvenirs of the ancestors. The breast symbolized the progenitors or parents in the palaver. We have already explained this earlier, that the word beloved translates as uncle, but we have chosen to say you. Translation of verse 13, you are to us a people whose souvenirs date back to the times of our ancestors and whose history is engraved in the hearts of our parents. The Sunamite from the Black from Egypt continues on in verse 14, quote, my beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of Engedi. She continues, Pastor Odimba states, she continues and compares Solomon to a cluster of privets and vines of Engedi. One of the uses of the privet among the Orientals is for making trademarks with the juice of its leaves. Its bunches are precious and firmly attached to the plant. Engedi means a fountain for kids. As regards debates in the palaver, one never begins nor ends one's submissions without giving compliments to one's interlocutor. This approach gives an indication of something that is precious. You would observe that each person praises the other at the beginning and the end of each submission. Translation of verse 14. As a precious bunch is attached to a vine, which is always by an inexhaustible fountain, so are you attached to our hearts. King Solomon then responds in verse 15, quote, you are beautiful, my love. You are beautiful. Your eyes are doves, end quote. Pastor Odimba states this, the word, quote, beloved, end quote, is in this sentence is Yahweh, which means handsome, beautiful, elegant, good, remarkable, adorn. In the palaver, when the participants begin to use the expressions of the high nobility, such as you are so beautiful, it means that your opinions are good and we accept them, or simply that we are very much touched by this expression. The eyes are representative of long-term or short-term vision. It is the symbol of thought or project. Translation of verse 15. Your utterances are good, remarkable, elegant, and you have got a good, clear, and balanced initiative. In verse 16 continues as the Sunamite, the Black from Egypt, responds, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly lovely. Our couch is green. As Solomon, Pastor Odimba states, the Sunamite uses the same expression, the bed being a place of rest. It symbolizes environment in Palaver language. Greenness is symbolic of fertility, blessing, and wealth. The translation of verse 16, your utterances are good, remarkable, elegant, and excellent, and we think that our interaction will give us relief. Verse 17, the Sunamite, the Black from Egypt, continues, quote, the beams of our house are cedar, our rafters are pine. Pastor Odimba states this, why does the Sunamite talk about the beams and rafters in a house during her amorous encounter? In the Bible dictionary, the beams are considered to play a major role in that part of the building that serves to support other planks in the process of house construction. The cedar is a type of hardwood from Lebanon that is used in making beams that can stand the test of time. The cypress pine is a resiniferous tree that remains green and straight. Its wood is enduring. Translation of verse 17, we think we are building on a solid ground, such a frame of beams and the rafters. It is our belief that we are going to remain faithful to our commitments to our future generations, just as the cypress pine remains the same through thick and thin. Okay, so that's going to conclude chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. The translation of the Song of Solomon in the framework of the African Palaver in the literary genre of prophetic narrative. Next week, we will continue reading and translating chapter 2, where it will continue it with verse 1, the Sunamite, the Black from Egypt, where she states, quote, I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. And so we will leave you with this reading and conversation, and I hope you enjoyed this research and investigation and continued discussion. We will leave you with a final word from King Solomon recorded in his Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 16, where he states, how much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather to be chosen than silver. Peace and blessings to all who love the truth. And Jesus Christ stated that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Thank you for your time. Happy studying. Love you.